So I have my body pieces here and I've attached them on the one side seam. I'm going to go ahead and attach my binding on to the body. So there's 3 places that the binding is going to go. I'm going to have a long binding that runs along this lower edge, and it's just going to be a self fabric binding attached, making sure I'm folding the binding in half, wrong sides together, and then attaching the binding along the edge. Now when I do these inside curves, I want to make sure that I pull this binding a little bit as I'm attaching it. The outside curves, you don't need to pull it as tight, but you always want to have a little bit of tension applied to that binding. Otherwise, you'll end up with binding that sticks up like this, and that's not what you want. You want it to sit smooth, and there's extra stretch in it so that it will give the ease that you need, but it's really important you pull it tight in these inside curves. Now the same will apply with attaching the binding along the top edges. You're going to fold your binding wrong sides together. I like to make sure that I leave some overhang so that I have extra fabric to work with when I'm doing my overlap. I don't want to start right at the edge because it's too hard to work with that bulky edge. So make sure you leave yourself a little bit of extra so that you can have something to grab onto, and then just pull it a little bit on the outer curves, pull it a little extra on the inside curves. Now you don't want to pull it to the extent that there's nothing left. You just want to pull it a little bit. So maybe 50% pull here, 25% tension there. So I'll be right back with those bindings attached. So the binding's all been attached now. Looks a little funny. It's all kind of twisting and turning all over the place. So the next step is to just make sure that this seam is folded under, and then add a top stitch, making sure to catch that seam. And you want to be really close to where the seam is, like maybe 1 millimeter or 2 millimeters over, making sure that you're catching the seam on this side to force the binding to lay flat. And we're going to go all the way along this edge, and we're going to do the same thing at the top. We're going to fold it to make sure that the raw edge is folded down, and we're going to just catch it doing a top stitch right beside where that seam is, and that'll just force the binding to all face the right way so that you're not having it turn out with the raw edge showing at all. So I've added the top stitch. It is a little curly right now. If you want it to lay flat, if you're sewing it, you can always just press it down with a little bit of steam and heat, and you can get all these edges to lay nice and flat, and give it a nice pressed look for sewing. I'm just making this for my daughter. I'm not going to worry. I know once it washes, it's going to end up getting a little rippled. And the other thing with the neckline is once it's pulled tight to attach, it smooths it out as well. And this piece with the snaps, once it's pulled tight underneath, you don't really see it. So I don't worry too much about it. But if you do want a nice flat look, you can just press it out and that'll take all that little ripple out. Now the last step is I'm just going to attach the side seam. And this is a good example of where we're going to close the binding. So when you're stitching the side seam, you just want to make sure that it lines up really nice. Once that's done, you can just fold that seam over and tack it, and that'll give you a nice secured binding, and it closes it off really nicely. So I will just take that over to the machine and then be right back. So I've got that last seam serged. You can see the binding. I just made sure to line it up really nicely at the edge and along there. Another nice finishing touch on an edge like that, just to avoid having any unraveling later on, is I like to take a darning needle and take my tails from my serger and just feed it back up into that seam before I do my tacking stitch. This is a tight seam, so it'll hold nicely. And then I can just trim that edge, and I'll go ahead and I'll just do a little tacking stitch along there, just securing that edge down and making sure that nothing's going to unravel in that edge, because I don't want it coming apart there. And then attaching the sleeves and the top is the last step for this bodysuit, and applying the snaps down here, and the bodysuit will be done. There's a separate video on how to do the fold over cuffs that's posted in my YouTube channel. You can just go ahead and watch that one if you're unsure. And that is the bodysuit almost complete.